Let's now add a table to the database so that we can store all our application data in there. So this is where we left off after the last lecture. Now, if you're somewhere else here in the interface, for example, here on the homepage, then you simply need to come here to the table editor. And so here we are. So to create a new table, as you can guess, just click here, and then we get this input form here. So the first thing that we need to specify is, of course, the name of the table. So I will simply call it facts, simply because this is where we will store all of our facts. Then here it's very important that we keep this turned on, and we don't need any real time. All right. And so with these basic definitions out of the way, we're ready to create our columns in the table. Now we could also import data from a spreadsheet here, and that would then automatically create the columns. But here I want to show you how we can do that manually, basically. So we will now create the schema, so to say, so like a blueprint of the table. And then in the next step, we will then add some data. So all the facts that we saw in the sample application. Okay, now what data do we actually need about each of the facts? So in other words, which columns are we going to need in this table? So first of all, each fact is going to have a unique ID, which is this one here, and this will be our primary key, which means many different things. One of them that there can be no duplicates in this ID. But this ID will also get automatically created for us, so that's no problem. Then by default, we also get this created at, which will simply be the current date, basically. So the time and date at which a new fact is created. So these two are basically automatically created, but now we can add our own columns. And the first one is the text for the fact. And now here we need to choose the type of data that we are going to store here. So these here are for numbers without floating points, which means without a decimal part. These are for decimal parts. And then here we have text. So we could use text or varchar for text, but we're just going to go with this one here. So that's easy enough. Next up, we need a source. So that's going to be like a link, so a URL. And here again, that's just some simple text, right? And in both of them, we have no default value, all right? Next up, we want the category. So basically, so that we can get this data here, right? So we already have data for the text here. We have data for the URL that will be stored, or that will actually be placed here. And now we're creating the column for this piece of data here, so for the category. And next up, we will also create 3 pieces of data for these 3 votes, so that each time that a user votes, so that they click on one of these buttons, that value can then be increased in the database. Because that's the whole point of having the database. So it's to have persistent data that lives on our server and that we can then load into our database. But anyway, let's now create these remaining columns in the table. Actually right here. So the category is again text. And again, there's no default value. And now the votes for interesting. And here we can use some integer, let's say int 4, but the other ones would work just as well. And here let's actually create a default value. So when we create a new fact, so when we add a new row to our database, by default it will get 0 votes for interesting, which makes sense, right? So when the fact is new, it should of course start at 0. Then we want votes for mind-blowing. Again, an integer 4, did I spell this correctly? Mind-blowing, yep. So here it's important that we do everything right. I'm not sure if we can change it later. Never tried that. Finally, votes false, int 4 again, and that's set 0. Okay, and that's it. Everything looks correct. Make sure yours is also correct, and then save it. And so now it's creating the new table. Okay, let's wait for it. And here we go. So we have our new table, as you can see here on this left side. And now here we can edit the table. So we can simply come here to the table and then we can start inserting some data. Now, where does this data actually come from? Well, of course, if you want to do that, you can create your own facts. So just add some text, some source, and some category. And if you want even these numbers of votes. But I prepared already for you some sample facts, so some sample data. So what we're going to do is to come here to this data.js, so this starter file that I prepared for you. And then down here, I have this link to a Google Doc. So just hit Command or Control, and then you can click this link. Or of course, you can also just copy paste it. Okay, and so now we can go ahead and copy paste each of them to our Supabase database. So I will just put this here on the left side and this on the right side. And so then we can just copy paste it very quickly. So the ID we don't need because as it says here, it's automatically generated. So just come here, copy and paste that here. Then the same thing for the source, copy, paste, and the category is history. Now here, actually, I also have the votes for each of them, but I will not bother putting them here. So we will just simply start everything at 0. But if you want, again, you can also go ahead and copy and paste these values down here. Okay, give it a save, just to see what that's going to look like. And so indeed, now we have our first value here. We just open it up again so I can show you something. Because let's imagine that you actually did some mistake here. So you can just double click any of these cells, right? And then you can change something here. And then, as it says here, just hit enter to save the changes. So for example, let's say here it was actually histories, or something like that. So it takes a second and then here it gets updated. But of course, that should be history. And that's it. Okay, let's move it right back to the right side, and then we can continue inserting the data. Now, I will not bother you with that here, so I will just fast forward that entire process, but you can now, if you want, go ahead and copy and paste all of these remaining rows here into the database, just like I did before. Or you can just take a few of them, or as I said before, you can just make up your own, of course. Okay, so I have all my sample data loaded here now. So let's now go here to this API documentation page. Okay, so that now we can see if we can access this data on our computer. So if we can access this API, which again is basically an interface that we can use to request data and then receive data. And if we were to try to build and assemble all this by hand, it would be a lot of work. And I actually have a course on how to do that, which is called Node.js. So that's a technology of using JavaScript on the server. But I definitely recommend when you're just starting out to simply do this. This is so much easier, especially for when you just need a very simple API with a simple database like we have here. But anyway, so here we have this page for the introduction, which feel free to read if you want. The same here with the authentication. So there's all kinds of stuff you could learn here, but it's not really necessary for us here. We're just trying to get the job done. And so let's come here to our facts table. So this is the table that we just created. And here is the documentation on how we can do different things using a JavaScript SDK. Now, that is something we will not do yet. We will do it in the next section. So for now, let's click here on Bash. So Bash, and then here, where it says Project API Key, let's click on Anon. So this will then basically show our public key. That's because each of these APIs and each of these databases and backends that you create has this API key. And only when you have this key, you can actually create requests to the database. So let's now go ahead and copy what is here by clicking on the copy button or just copying this string here, so this text. So I will just copy, and now let's go back to VS Code. Okay, but we cannot really yet get this data somewhere into our application. For now, the only thing we can do is to open up a terminal and try it there. So let's go here to View, and then here you have the terminal. So wait for it. Okay, so now your terminal might look a little bit different, but that's not a problem. Now the terminal is this kind of scary looking thing that you sometimes see in the movies where people hack some code into and make things happen. Now, if you're on a Mac, you can also access the terminal by simply opening it here like this. And you see I still have some stuff in here. And on Mac, you can run your command line as well. I think it's called a prompt or a PowerShell. But here in VS Code, we also have the integrated terminal. And so we can just run some commands here. For example, a very basic command that you can run on the Mac or on Linux is ls, and on Windows it's dir. So just write this and hit enter. And so this will then give you all the files in the current directory. So when you're in the terminal, you are always in some directory. And so in this case, when you open it in VS Code, it will automatically go to the directory where your project folder is located. Okay? But even if it's not, that part really doesn't matter. All that matters is that we now can paste our code, so the thing that we just copied before, in there. And then with your arrow keys, please navigate a little bit through this and go here to this part. So can you see it? So right here is where I'm trying to edit. So move your cursor here and then delete this part so that you only have this URL. So this is your URL of your database. So it's this thing here, .superbase.co/rest/v1/facts, which is the name of the table. Then this command also adds your API key here and here again. And then we can hit enter. Okay, and then you get back probably this empty structure here. This is called an empty array. Now, if you got any kind of error, so if something didn't work, then please don't worry. That's no problem at all. This is really mainly to show you that we need to do something now, because of course we actually do have some data in our facts table, which means that here we should now get that data back and not this empty data structure. So what we need to do now in order to allow this client here to access and read this data is to enable something called row level security policies. So let's do that in the next video.